We live in a time that we may easily be confused, trying to figure out God's ways in our life. And once you see God taking over, you will experience a peace that can never be shaken. Welcome to Bridge-Builders, where we connect church lingo and culture with our faith, hoping that this will help us grow in our understanding to live out our purpose. My name is Sung Soo John. You can call me RJ, and I'm really grateful that you are here as we are going to talk about discerning God's will. Thank you once more for tuning in, but I want to ask you if you can subscribe, like, or comment, or if you discern it is God's will to do so, please do it so we can further our reach. I'm going to talk about this concept of discernment of God's will. Now, I am going to give you a disclaimer that this is such a vast subject that I don't think that it could be contained into one video, and then we can go on and on and on. And if there are anything that you have more questions, I can also talk about it later on in some other episodes. But I want to start by this idea of discerning God's call. Discerning, as you all may already know, it is what we're doing. We're trying to figure out God's will. A lot of times what we think in prayer is, we think that prayer is something that we give to God and say, hey, God, I want you to do this. But I do want to remind you, yes, there is that portion of prayer that we present our prayers to God, our prayer requests. God, Lord, help us in this. But a lot of the times what our prayer should be focused on is being in alignment of God's will. So our prayers, after we share all the prayers and the needs that we have, I do believe that there needs to be an equal amount of effort of us trying to find how God's will and what God's will is, and our effort of trying to align ourselves to God's will. One other disclaimer I want to make, I believe in God's will. I don't think there is a right or a wrong discernment. Because if we talk about these binary choices, where a lot of the times that when we're praying, we're actually praying with a lot of binary choices, I don't necessarily believe that God punishes us because we had the discernment wrong. A lot of the times it is, if we see the discernment as a journey, a lot of times it's because we continue to try to press toward our own will instead of aligning ourselves to God's will. That makes us kind of come into some negative situations that we don't like. And of course, I'm maybe generalizing that too much, but there doesn't seem to be a right or a wrong discernment. However, what God really wants to see in us is how much do we have a heart to discern God's will. So if you have a problem in your life, and of course you can always supplicate and you can always ask, Lord, I need your help in this, I need your help in this. But what if we change our prayers in saying, Lord, but what is your will in this whole situation? Where do you need me to change? And how can I change? But more importantly, in that, Lord, help me to change. Another thing about discernment is, how can we hear God's voice? There are people who come to me and ask, Pastor, how do you know God's will? And first, I would have to say, I do believe that God speaks to us, whether it is in gentle whisper or whether it is in times of God just sounds like God's screaming onto us. I do believe that God speaks to us. However, even though there might be times that God uses signs, I don't necessarily really believe in signs. There are times that God will use signs, but more to have our attention. But I don't rely on signs as an answer to God's prayer. Let's say, for instance, that you want something that may not be God's will, and you continue to pray about it, and somehow on your social network feed, something comes up. It may be a coincidence, but can we really say that that was God's will? Or would it be the phone listening to us and bringing up all these advertisements that tricks us into thinking that that's God's will? What I believe that we really need to do in order to listen to God's voice. Number one, we should be fully opened to follow God's will. A lot of times we say we're going to follow God's will, but there's so much in us that wants God to follow our ways instead of us following God's. So there needs to be that preparation of heart for us to follow God's way. The second one that I would say is for us to recognize God's voice in our lives. And how do you do it? There's a lot of other ways to do it, but the most proven ways of listening and figuring out God's will is, I believe, through reading the Bible. The way that I understand reading the Bible is learning God's language that is completely different with the language of this world. And more we learn God's language in our lives, when God's gentle whisper, when God's voice speaks to us, a lot of times because we don't know God's will, because we don't know God's word, we could have easily not detected it or found it. But more you read the Bible, the more you'll be familiar with God's voice and God's accent. You'll be able to say, wow, that was God speaking to me. But in the discernment, I believe that when you're following God's will, there is going to be a tremendous peace in your heart. Even though everything that you're following may bring more difficulties and may bring more trials onto the journey, as long as you have that heart of peace, that you are so certain that this is God's will, I believe that peace will testify that you are in that discernment of following God's way. So I'm going to share a short story of my experience where some people may say that it's debatable, and that may be true. But for me, it was a clear discernment. As you know, I am from South Korea. And there was a time in ministry that I was actually sent by the United Methodist Church to serve in Korea for 3 years. I was on there for what we call an unloan appointment. Serving the home church and the church that I grew up in and also in Korean, which is my first language, I loved it. I saw so much fruit. I saw much joy in ministry. Not saying that I don't have any joy here, but there's a different kind of, I would say, fulfillment that I had there. But I sensed that God may be calling me back, but I didn't want to go. So I continued on to serve. And because at the time I was on a green card and there were some things that if I didn't go back to the States on a certain timeline, that my green card will be revoked and it will be, I will not be able to come back to America and serve. I said, let me just ride the wave, not pray, and just see how the green card expires. And by that time, God would say, okay, I give up so you can continue to serve in Korea. As the date was approaching, I was hit by this corner that I felt that I had to surrender into God's will. But when I surrendered, I just didn't want to do it alone. I wanted to do a final prayer in a way of saying, Lord, no, you're the one who sent me over here. Why are you asking me to go back? And I had this little complaining session with God. And I can go on in details of all how that happened. By the end of that prayer, this is what had happened. Some of you might say I'm crazy to say that. But for me, it was as if I heard, after I poured out my heart, after I poured all my contempt to God, after I poured out my heart saying, Lord, I know that I cannot hold on to my ways anymore. I surrender. In a way, I was saying, what is your ways? For me, it was as if God was saying, I'm in charge, not you. There was a miracle. And that miracle was not because I heard God's voice. The miracle was when my heart completely changed instantaneously and said, yes, Lord. And I had this peace of knowing how coming back to the States was God's will. Turns out that my wife knew it way before I did, because immediately I called her and I said, we're going back to the States, and she was responding by saying, I knew it all along, I just needed to give you some time. We live in a time that we may easily be confused, trying to figure out God's ways in our life. In the time that you are confused, I would have to say the best way for us to discern God's will is to focus on how we can surrender our hearts and our ways in front of God's ways. And once you see God taking over, and once you see God leading you, you will experience a peace that can never be shaken. I know this time was limited for us to really understand how to discern God's will, but I hope that it points us to the right direction. And may you be able to figure out, discern, and follow God's will faithfully in your life as you cultivate a heart to align yourself with God's way.